This haunting video was taken just moments before a pilot's reckless mistake killed a plane full of Instagram stars shortly after takeoff. Several of the passengers posted photos and video literally minutes before they were to meet a fiery death. Sit back and get ready because this is a tragic story with a lot of lessons that we can learn from. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story takes place in Scottsdale, Arizona in the early evening hours when a Piper Comanche aircraft carrying 6 people crashed and was destroyed just 70 seconds after takeoff. The 23-year-old Instagram model, Mariah Coogan, posted this video as she boarded the aircraft. Mariah is sitting in the middle row and seated next to her is 28-year-old Anand Patel. Anand was a successful entrepreneur and social media influencer who is known by the nickname Happy. Happy shared this photo just prior to the flight as he was excited for what might have been his first time flying on a private aircraft. Seated in the back of the airplane are 22-year-old Helena Lagos, who is a part-time Las Vegas fashion model, and 23-year-old Iris Rodriguez, who is visiting from Honduras. You can see the 2 pilots in Mariah's video, but there's 2 important things you need to know. First, this video is reversed because of how Mariah filmed it, so this is the way it should look. And the second thing is that only one of these guys is a real pilot. 32-year-old Eric Valente is the real pilot on this aircraft, and he's sitting in the right seat. Eric has an airline transport pilot certificate and is a certified flight instructor, and he had about 5,200 hours of total flight time, but he only had about 200 hours flying Piper Comanches. And the very first time that he flew the accident aircraft was when he flew it from North Las Vegas down to Scottsdale to pick up the student pilot. The chief pilot at the company that Eric worked for said that he was a great pilot and he will be missed. But we'll talk more about Eric later. 28-year-old James Pedroza is a student pilot and he's sitting in the left seat for the flight. About 2 months prior to the crash, James shared on Instagram how he had just bought the aircraft, but really he had only bought a fractional interest, and I'll explain why that's important later. For now, what you need to know is that even though James is an avid traveler, he's essentially a brand new student pilot, and he's the one that's organized this trip. The other thing that's really important to know is that student pilots are not permitted to act as pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying a passenger. This means that James should have been in the right seat, and Eric should have been in the left seat, and this should have been a non-instructional flight, but this was just the first reckless mistake that contributed to this tragedy. In order to understand all of the contributing factors to this disaster and see how some of the holes in the Swiss cheese model lined up, it's important to understand how James and Eric ended up flying together. You see, James didn't really own the plane. He bought kind of a fractional interest in it from his friend Josh. The real owner of the plane was someone that we'll call Mr. B. James was down in Scottsdale and he wanted to take his friends up to Las Vegas where he was a VIP host at the Mirage nightclub. The only problem was the plane was at the North Las Vegas airport and James needed someone to fly it down and pick them up. James's old flight instructor had backed out of the trip, so James called Josh for help, but Josh was also unable to bring the plane down, so Josh put James in touch with Eric Valente to do the trip. However, when Eric heard that James was a student, he told Josh that this flight would not be instructional in nature because he hadn't even sat down with James to do any ground lessons. Now keep that in mind because remember, Eric is in the right seat for the flight and James is in the left seat, and wait until you hear what Eric said on the radio. The other thing that's worth noting that almost prevented this flight from happening is the fact that the aircraft owner, Mr. B, he only met Eric for the first time on the day of the accident, and he questioned who he was, and he even considered not letting him take the aircraft, but he eventually agreed to let Eric proceed with the flight. The other shocking thing is that the owner had no idea that James planned to take 4 passengers with him on the trip, and perhaps if the owner knew that, then he most likely wouldn't have allowed the flight to happen. The aircraft they're flying is tail number November 9456 Papa, and it's a 1964 Piper PA-24-260 Comanche. This is a video that was shared on Instagram by James, the student pilot, and you can see just how small the aircraft is. Even though this aircraft is marketed as capable of having seating for 6, most pilots won't take more than 4 adults, especially if you have luggage, or they might only allow for a dog or a small child in the very back. And if you look closely at this image from the video, according to the owner, these are just seat cushions resting against the floor. There's nothing holding them in place. and the investigation confirmed that there was no seat structure in the aft area where two of the girls were sitting. Look, if someone tries to get you to fly in a plane that doesn't have a properly secured seat, that might be your first clue to not get on the plane, and just because an aircraft has 6 seats in it, that doesn't necessarily mean it can carry 6 adults, but we'll talk more about that later because that wasn't the only issue on this flight. At the time of the flight, there weren't any known malfunctions with the aircraft, so the pilots had every reason to believe the aircraft was in an airworthy condition. In fact, all of the previous flights, the aircraft seemed to fly just fine without any problems. According to a witness, James showed up at the airfield with his 4 friends, and while they were hanging out waiting for Eric to show up with the plane, the witness overheard James talking about how he needed just a few more hours before he could solo the aircraft. The witness also said that he was surprised to find out that all of them were going to try to fit in the airplane, but he didn't say anything about it. The witness would go on to say that after Eric showed up with the plane, during the boarding process, Eric came into the lobby and he appeared flustered, but Eric didn't say anything. Remember, Eric had said this was not going to be an instructional flight. That meant Eric flew down there planning on James flying in the right seat for the trip back to Vegas. That's why, in my opinion, I think there's 2 reasons that Eric might have appeared flustered. First, just like the aircraft owner, it's possible that Eric had no idea there were going to be 4 passengers showing up with James for the flight. And I think the second reason he might have been flustered is that maybe James asked Eric if he could sit in the left seat and be the one to do the takeoff or fly the plane, perhaps wanting to show off a little bit for his friends. Eric has enough experience and training to know that James shouldn't be in the left seat, and I can't think of any other really good reason why James would end up sitting there. And the truth is we don't know why James ended up in the left seat, and it wasn't possible for the NTSB to determine who performed the takeoff or who was on the controls when they crashed. However, I wanted to share my opinion because I can see how Eric might have found himself in a difficult position because he's about to get hired as the instructor, so he'd be risking his job if he said no and refused to do the flight. I'll talk more about this later, but one of the big lessons from this tragedy is that it's so important for pilots, whether you're an instructor or not, to set limits before you fly with someone or before you take a job. You have to be willing to say no or just walk away from a flight sometimes, and unfortunately, Eric gets in the aircraft in the right seat and they taxi out for takeoff. The tower controller cleared the flight to taxi to runway 03 for takeoff. This runway is over 8,000 feet long and the tower is located near the center of the runway. Using footage from some of the airfield cameras, the NTSB was able to piece together what happened. From the time they start the takeoff roll to the time they impact the ground is only about 70 seconds. As soon as they get airborne, the tower controller noticed the wings rocking left and right. Another witness on the ground confirmed seeing something similar, saying the nose was also pitching up and down, and the movements were so aggravated it almost seemed as if the pilot was playing around. The tower controller said that eventually the aircraft appeared to be stable on wings level flight as they passed by the control tower, which remember is halfway down the runway. However, the controller said it didn't sound like the aircraft had enough engine power, so listen to what she said and the pilot's response.
Comanche 56 Papa, experiencing any difficulty?
We're good. We're just at training lunch with 56 Papa.
I'll talk about the pilot's response in a minute, but as the aircraft continued to fly away, it started a left-hand turn near the departure end of the runway. It continued that left turn until it went into a nose-down configuration and crashed. You can see what happens in this video clip here. This was taken from a traffic camera, and you'll see the aircraft enter the frame at the top right as it's making the left-hand turn. I have to warn you though that this footage might be tough to watch for some viewers.
And 56 Papa, we'd like to.
Comanche 56 Papa, say again?
What caused them to crash? First of all, we know that from witness testimony, they confirmed it was Eric talking on the radio who said, "We're good, we're just a training lesson." To me, that indicates that it's possible that James was the one doing the takeoff, and although the aircraft was struggling to climb, Eric might have just assumed that that was due to the fact that James was flying and not necessarily because there was anything wrong with the aircraft. The temperature at the time of their takeoff was 28 degrees Celsius or 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And because the field elevation is about 1,500 feet, that gave them a density altitude of around 3,000 feet. According to the NTSB, under those conditions, at max gross weight, the aircraft should have been capable of climbing at a rate of 700 feet per minute, but here's what really happened. The blue line on this chart shows the aircraft altitude during the flight. You'll notice that the data starts when the aircraft is already 59 feet above the ground, and that's because the camera footage prior to that was washed out, so the NTSB had to approximate what happened before that point. The NTSB concluded the aircraft started its takeoff roll about 45 seconds prior to the first data point on this chart and became airborne 18 seconds prior to this point. That means it took them 18 seconds to climb 59 feet above the ground, and then they continued the climb at only 270 feet per minute for the next 27 seconds, and then after that they virtually stopped climbing. The most important thing you can take away from this is that when you try to take off, if your aircraft isn't performing the way you expect it to perform, then as long as you have runway in front of you, just abort the takeoff and set it back down on the ground. These are the kind of things that Eric should have been thinking about before they took off. This is only his second flight in the aircraft. He's letting the student sit in the left seat. It's nighttime, and it's probably an unfamiliar airfield for Eric, and he's got a fully loaded aircraft. This is another great reminder to always use the full-length runway whenever you have it available for takeoff, because remember, it took them 18 seconds to make it 59 feet in the air, and at that point, they had over 4,000 feet of runway remaining to set it back down and figure out what's wrong. The tower even asked them if there was a problem, and for some reason, Eric said they're a training lesson and they keep flying even though the aircraft wasn't climbing. And as soon as they started that left-hand turn, they exceeded the critical angle of attack, stalled the aircraft, and crashed on the edge of the golf course. The NTSB determined that one of the contributing factors to the crash was the number 3 engine cylinder valve spring. The spring had broken into 4 pieces, and examination of the other 5 cylinders revealed no anomalies. The investigation concluded that the spring failure happened during a previous flight, but they couldn't determine how long ago that was, and that spring failure caused a degraded engine power output, which reduced the aircraft's climb capability, but this wasn't the root cause of the tragedy. If you remember from earlier, James had bought a fractional interest in the aircraft from his friend Josh. That's how James was able to use the aircraft. On the day of the accident, Josh must have had a premonition because Josh was worried about the number of passengers on the plane and their weight, and he texted James, and this is the text conversation he had. Make sure you guys aren't overweight or anything. Eric is by the book. Unfortunately, James has no idea how to do that, so Josh asked him about the passengers and their luggage. James listed off only 5 weights, even though there's 6 people on the trip. Those weights added up to 675 pounds, and James said they'd only have about 10 pounds of luggage. Josh asked him about the gross weight of the plane, which really he's asking him what the useful load is, and James correctly said that it's 1,200 pounds. That's basically how much weight they can carry for passengers, luggage, usable fuel, and drainable oil. Ultimately, Josh says they're good, but he told James to go over all of this with Eric, and this is just another hole in the Swiss cheese model because Josh highlighted the risk and assumed that James would at least go over the numbers with Eric. Unfortunately, my guess is that never happened, and perhaps Eric didn't bother to do a weight and balance calculation either because the combined weight of all 6 passengers was actually almost 950 pounds, and that meant they were about 135 pounds over their max gross weight when they took off, and their center of gravity was just over 2 inches aft of their limit. And I'm sure that to this very day, Josh regrets not doing more to keep them safe. The broken cylinder spring that I mentioned earlier wasn't detectable on previous flights because those flights weren't done near the max gross weight. However, it became very noticeable when they tried to take off with 6 people on board and they needed all the engine power they could get. It really sucks that the spring was broken because if it wasn't, then they just might have survived, but that's no excuse for not doing a weight and balance calculation or making the other reckless mistakes on this flight. And to top it all off, the toxicology test found cocaine and ecstasy in James's blood and urine, but because it was such a low amount, and due to the fact that cocaine has a very short half-life, the NTSB determined that drug use was not a factor in this tragedy. The NTSB said the probable cause was the flight instructor's failure to maintain aircraft control during the initial climb as a result of the aircraft being loaded above its maximum gross weight. However, I think the root cause of this tragedy was Eric's decision to conduct the flight with James in the left seat. And it sucks because I think Eric found himself in a tight spot and he didn't say no. He could have easily done a weight and balance and said, I'd really like to take you, but the weight is just too much and I've only flown this aircraft once before. Or if he really felt compelled to do the flight, then he should have made James sit in the right seat, and then perhaps Eric would have recognized how poorly the aircraft was performing and made the decision to set it back down on the runway, but we'll never know for sure, and 6 lives were lost in this terrible tragedy. If you want to watch another video about some reckless mistakes that other pilots have made, be sure to check out one of these other videos on the screen, and I'll see you next time.